seeing but blind. Seeing but blind. You may be seated. Life is full of people thinking and seeing the way they are compared to the way God sees them. I said people see themselves much differently than the way God sees them. People seem to think that they are saved, and yet in reality they may think they are saved, but they're on their way to hell. It is extremely important to realize and understand the story of Saul. Saul thought that he was doing his Christian's duty. I said Saul thought that he was doing his Christian's duty. He not only did he think that he was doing his Christian's duty, but if you look at the text, you'll discover that Saul wanted to make sure he was doing the right thing because he got letters from the so-called preachers. Y'all gonna talk to me. He got letters from the so-called preachers, and so he had not only a sanctified mind, but he also had letters in his hand. He was seeing, and he thought he was seeing the right thing and doing the right thing. Isn't it funny that sometimes you think you are doing right, but God has another plan? Isn't it funny to think that I am okay when in reality I am not okay? And now Saul is on his way to Damascus. And while Saul is on his way to Damascus, he gets to the outskirts of town. He gets into the downtown area, and you know the story. As he is walking and as he is riding on his horse, in our day and time, he might have been driving his Mercedes or whatever. But in our day and time, he would be driving and not on a horse. And as he gets into the main section of downtown, suddenly a light comes on Saul, and he is blinded. Well, and he falls on his knees because he is blinded. But what was it that was blinding him? Was it physical blindness or was it spiritual blindness? Y'all didn't hear what I just said. Was it physical blindness or was it spiritual blindness? Notice in the text that when Saul discovers that he's blinded, he's given instructions on where to go. And yet he speaks to the Lord and he fasts and he prays, but he stays blind. It's not until 3 days later that the text goes on to say that the scales fell off his eyes. The scales, I said, fell off his eyes. I'm going to say it again. The scales, I said, fell off his eyes. And when the scales fell off his eyes, can I ask you one type of a question? He was seeing, but what in reality was he seeing? He was no longer seeing physical side, but he was seeing the spiritual side. I said he was no longer just seeing physically, but he was seeing spiritually. I said he was no longer seeing just physically, but he was also seeing spiritually, which makes a difference in our lives. My question is, how many of you are looking physically at your sight, but not looking spiritually and physically. I'm going to say that again. I'm going to say it again. Because inside the walls of this church, too many of us are seeing physically and are not seeing spiritually. I'm going to say it one more time. Too many of us are seeing physically and we're not seeing spiritually. I'm going to say it one more time. Too many of us are seeing physically and not seeing spiritually. Matthew chapter 20, verses 29, 30 to 34. There is only two men mentioned in the New Testament. There's only two men mentioned in the entire Testament that Jesus addresses that's really blind. The first man that Jesus addresses is the two men as Jesus is passing by. These two men are blind physically. They cannot see, and Jesus asks the question. The question is, what do you want? Because the text says that Jesus has compassion upon them. And he asks them, what do you want? They say, we want to be able to see. Now, the text never says what they did after they started seeing. But the text does say that they leave praising God. And anytime you have been touched by the Master and able to see not only physically but spiritually, you ought to be able to praise the Lord. Then there is blind Bartimaeus. Blind Bartimaeus is born blind. People question as was he born blind due to the fact that his parents sinned. And the text goes on to say that no, but blind Bartimaeus is born blind based on the fact it's for the glory of God. I said it was for the glory of God, and God causes him to see. But now, brothers and sisters, there is an issue about seeing. I said there is an issue about seeing. Ephesians 4:18. Ephesians 4:18 says, look at it. I want y'all to look at it. Having the what? Darkened, being what? Alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. Anytime we have members or family members in the church who don't want to work with one another, there's blindness not in sight, but blindness in the heart. Anytime that we know that there is a ministry that needs to go forth, and I ain't. That's blindness in the what, everybody? Blindness in the heart. It is blindness in the heart. And the thing about this church, out of all of the churches that I've ever pastored, and I've pastored some good churches, this church has some of the greatest talent. Am I right about it? This church has some of the greatest talent, the most sacrificial giving folk that I have ever experienced in my life. And Satan is trying to prevent this church from moving forward. Am I right about it? And until we get ourselves together, we're not going anywhere. We must learn how to see spiritually before we start trying to see physically. Then finally, Revelation 3:18. Revelation 3:18 Say, here's what I want you to do. Buy your what? From me. Buy your gold from who? Buy your gold from me. Gold that's been through the what? Then you'll be what? Buy your what? Clothes designed in what? You've gone around, had what? Long enough. And buy what? For your what? From who? So you can what? Really see. What are you seeing? What are you seeing, church? What are you seeing? Do you see us as a family, or do you just see me? What do you see? Do you see jealousy, backbiting? What do you see? Do you see yourself, or do you see us as a whole? What do you see? Just what do you see? Y'all quiet. Sometimes God moves folk out of the way for you to see. Are y'all in here? I have to learn how to not to see physically, but I've got to learn how to see spiritually. Because if I see spiritually, guess what? I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. So I must learn how not to see just physically, but I must learn how to see spiritually. Because if I see spiritually, I'm going to do the right thing. Doesn't matter who I am. Doesn't matter what it says. I am going to do the right thing because I am seeing spiritually. And if I see spiritually, I'm going to be touched by the Master's hand.